All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Department of Medicine Grand Rounds. It is my privilege and pleasure to introduce my friend and co-chief resident, Illana Krumm, who completed her undergraduate and medical education here at the University of Washington, staying on as a resident in internal medicine and chief resident, where she completed the medical education pathway, was awarded for her excellence in teaching, which is about to be on display. And as is noted, here is a social media guru with quite a number of followers on all of her social media accounts. We're delighted to have Illana sparing us some time from her busy attending on service to teach us about social media and medicine, the perks and pitfalls, and just so grateful to have learned so much from her over the years. So Illana is going to get us started with the presentation. As always, please feel free to drop comments or questions in the chat. We'll have a brief Q&A at the end of the presentation with Illana, and then we'll hand off to Dr. Steinberg and Ppe, who are going to be presenting awards for the last 10 minutes of the presentation. So thanks everyone for being here and for your attention. And Illana, thank you, and go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Johnny, for the very kind introduction. I am going to be talking about social media today. I don't have any official disclosures, though I feel like with that introduction, I should disclose that I do use social media. However, I am by no means an expert, despite what Johnny may say. So let's get started. For all of you joining in, this is not intended to be a how-to, nor is this an argument for or against the use of social media, but rather my goal is to discuss the role social media can play in medicine. And I'm going to be utilizing Twitter use during the COVID-19 pandemic as a framework for our understanding. And this is by no means comprehensive, but I hope to illustrate how social media impacts the dissemination of medical information, describe potential uses for epidemiologic surveillance and research, and demonstrate how it can be utilized for outreach and activism in medicine. But before we get to all of that, I want to make sure that we are on the same page about what social media actually is and why I think it matters. So broadly speaking, social media is any electronic platform through which users create online communities to share information, ideas, and content. And I'm sure you are familiar with many of these. Common ones are Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, even LinkedIn and YouTube fall under this category. And it turns out it's actually been around for a while. The first social media site started in 1997. It was called 6 Degrees, if any of you were early adopters out there. But since that time, there has been an exponential growth of both platforms and users. And current estimates put us at 3.9 billion social media users worldwide. And just in the time that we've been talking, there's an estimated 3,000 new accounts that have been created. Now, Facebook is the most popular with 2.7 billion users, and Twitter has 340 million users. Now, I'm going to be focusing on Twitter specifically today, but a lot of the patterns that I'm going to talk about have been shown on other social media platforms. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Twitter is what we call a microblog. Users can share 240 character messages and choose to attach images and links or videos. And the reason I'm focusing on Twitter today is because it's one of the fastest growing platforms in use, with 1 in 5 US adults having a Twitter account. And it also is one of the most popular among healthcare workers to use professionally. So a lot of folks are using Twitter and the number is growing every day. And turns out that recent surveys show that about 70% of those on Twitter actually use it as a primary news source, if not their only primary news source. And we also know that people are turning to Twitter more during times of crisis and natural disasters. Between April and June of 2020 alone, Twitter saw an increase of daily users by 34%. And we've seen this pattern of increase previously. We saw an increase with H1N1 in 2011, Ebola in 2014, and Zika in 2016. though the increase of use was on a smaller scale than what we're seeing with COVID-19, but folks are turning to Twitter for information and are doing so more frequently with this ongoing outbreak. So let's talk about how Twitter can impact dissemination of information. Now, I'm sure many of you remember that with the emergence of COVID, there was also an explosion of COVID-related publications. And between May and December 2020, there was an average of 2,000 publications per week. And for 2020 alone, there are 87,117 entries in PubMed pertaining to COVID, which is an enormous amount of information that no one person can keep up with on their own. And so often folks were actually turning to social media to help manage that information. But what each of us are seeing on our Twitter feeds can vary dramatically. So let's talk about why. So on Twitter, like all other social media, you build your own network of accounts and people that you follow. And effectively, this network acts as a filter. The more your community interacts with a topic or an account or particular content, the more likely you are to see that content. And the converse is also true. The less your network interacts with information or a specific topic, the less likely you are to see it. So effectively, by curating your network, you're actually curating the content you see. And this has been looked at. So this is a figure from a PNAS publication in 2017, and the graph depicts tweets of politically controversial topics, things like gun control, same-sex marriage, climate change, and also depicts their retweet activity. So each dot represents a user who sent a message, and each line represents another user retweeting that message. And the authors also went ahead and classified each user by their political ideology, and two large communities emerged, and they're shaded by their mean ideology, with the liberal mean in blue and the conservative mean in red. And as you can see, there's a lot of exchange within each group, but very little exchange between each group. So it turns out that exchange of information on Twitter is actually really siloed, and it's oftentimes within like-minded groups, which is important to think about if our patients or our colleagues are turning to Twitter for information. And it's particularly pertinent given the fact that COVID-19 has become so politicized. So this was a study that looked at political tweets and information exchange on Twitter, but also we've actually have publications that looked at the impact of Twitter on scientific publications. And it turns out that tweets can actually predict highly cited articles within the first 3 days of article publication. Now, it's unclear if social media activity actually increases citations or if it purely reflects the underlying qualities of that publication. However, we do know for a fact that the use of Twitter leads to quicker real-time dissemination of those publications than the more traditional means. And we also know that decreased time of dissemination of information is crucial in crisis management. And so some folks are arguing that we should actually utilize Twitter as a means of sharing information during public health crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Though others are worried that social media is actually leading to information mismanagement. So, as I mentioned briefly previously, with COVID-19, there was an explosion of COVID-related publications. And this is a figure from one of the major preprint servers, and it's their number of submissions received per week. And as you can see, starting in January, there was an exponential growth of submissions, most of which were COVID-related. But not only were they seeing more submissions, but there was also pressure for journals to turn around publications quickly. Now, this is the average number of days between manuscript submission and publication for 14 major journals. And before the pandemic, that time averaged about 117 days. But during the pandemic, that turnaround time dropped to just 60 days for COVID-related publications. And some journals were actually turning around papers within 2 weeks from submission to publication. And those published manuscripts were subsequently being shared on social media. Now, it's important to note that the Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, and JAMA were not included in this because that information wasn't available. However, the JAMA network did see 53% more submissions in the first quarter of 2020 compared to 2019. So we know that they're getting more submissions and the pressure to turn them around is very high. And so with that, there was concern about what kind of information and the quality of information that was being put out there. Now, with scientific publications, we have sort of an expected rate of retraction. Our knowledge changes, people make mistakes, it happens. And it turns out the rate of retraction has been pretty stable over the last few years, averaging about 4 retractions per 10,000 publications. Now, with COVID-related papers, that's actually increased to 10 per 10,000, which may not seem like a dramatic increase, but some of those retracted manuscripts made it into some pretty significant journals. There were 2 papers from the New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet regarding hydroxychloroquine use in COVID-19, which were subsequently retracted. And some people credit criticism that was very present on social media as contributing to their ultimate retraction. And others argue that this higher retraction rate is actually acceptable given that our knowledge of the pandemic was changing so rapidly. And that might be true. However, it turns out that information spreads differently on Twitter depending on whether it's true or false information. And so the question is, has this actually done more damage than good? So let's talk about how information spreads. So this group did a very large study of how information spreads on Twitter. What they did is they followed tweets over time and looked at their depth, which is the hops from the origin or the number of retweets or shares, as well as the size, the number of users involved in that information cascade over time. And they tracked it and they looked at a number of different topics from politics to terrorism, science and technology, as well as natural disasters. They followed other aspects of these tweets and information cascade, but I won't get into that today. And the patterns they found held true for regardless of what topics that they looked at. So let's look at a few of the results. So here they have the data for the false information cascades in red and the true information cascades in green. And as you can see, with each depth for the false information cascade, it took less time to reach that particular depth than the true information. And conversely, at each depth, the false information cascade was reaching more unique users than the true information. And they also saw that it took less time for those false information cascades to reach more users. And these patterns held true even when they controlled for emotional language and virulent speech, other aspects that might influence the rate of spread, and the pattern still held. So what they concluded is that false information spreads farther and faster than true information on Twitter. And there have actually been a couple other studies that found this as well. And so the concern is with those retracted papers, despite their swift retraction, have they spread too far and too fast for any correction to actually make a difference? Now, there's no data on that and we're not sure, but it's an important question to ask ourselves. And This spread of false information has been a concern on social media, and there have been very vocal criticisms of both Twitter and other social media platforms for contributing to the spread of false information. And Twitter has tried a couple of measures to combat this. One of this is what's called the verification process. So some accounts get, quote, verified, and they get a little blue check next to their mark. And as Twitter says, verification was meant to authenticate identity and voice, but it is interpreted as an endorsement or an indicator of importance. We recognize that we have created this confusion and need to resolve it. For the astute observer, you may note that that was posted in 2017. Well, it turns out it's still a problem today. People are still seeing this verification, this blue check, as a stamp of approval and actually as verification of their status as an expert, even though it's only intended to verify their identity, not their expertise. So this process has been put on hold multiple times during the last year and a half. It actually was just restarted a week ago, but it's unclear what changes they've made to the process and if there's actually been an improvement. There's actually complaints among some pretty prominent physicians on Twitter that they have yet to be verified, while other users have. So it really ultimately leads to a lot of confusion and misplaced trust. Another way that they've attempted to combat this information mismanagement is they've started this program called Birdwatch. It's effectively a community watch program for the internet. Essentially, users can report accounts or tweets that they're concerned about. Now, this is still in beta testing. There's really limited information on the efficacy of this program, and it's unclear if it's actually still ongoing. So it's a little hard to see what sort of measurable steps Twitter has taken to combat this misinformation. So it's important that we approach this information critically. Now, that was a whirlwind tour of how Twitter impacts information. And so big take homes for that, I want you to remember that the social network you build on Twitter and social media serves as an information filter. Engagement correlates with article citation, and use also leads to decreased time for information dissemination, but false information may spread faster than truth. So really it's on us as consumers to approach that information critically, like we would any other source of information. So that's a little bit about how Twitter impacts the information we receive. Let's talk about how it can be a source of information for research and surveillance. And to demonstrate this point, I'm going to take us back to another coronavirus that used to be making headlines, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, which was first identified in the Middle East in 2012. In 2015, there was an outbreak in South Korea. And so Shin et al. Posited, with this ongoing outbreak, can we actually use social media to augment our epidemiologic surveillance tools we already have in place? So what they did was they looked for the Google search term MERS originating in South Korea, and they also looked for MERS being mentioned on Twitter from tweets originating in South Korea, and they tracked those over time. And they compared that to the new confirmed lab cases of MERS that was documented, as well as the quarantined suspected cases. And they plotted those all here on normalized values for comparison. And so the Google searches are in green, the Twitter mentions are in purple, the new lab cases in blue, and quarantine cases are in red. And as you can see, the Google and Twitter mentions peak about 4 days prior to the peak in new lab cases. and about 9 days before the peak in quarantined cases. So the authors posited that we could actually use the information on social media as a public health surveillance tool. Now, some of you may look at this and think, well, actually, the peak on social media came before the peak of lab cases. Can we use it as a prediction tool? And it turns out that a group has actually looked at this. So what these folks did is they proposed that Twitter could be used to predict the next outbreak. And they used avian influenza in animals and livestock as a model. And so they followed tweets and they geolocated them, as well as ensured that they were actually talking about avian influenza. And then they followed those tweets and evaluated them for sentiment analysis, which is the process of computationally identifying and categorizing opinions expressed in each tweet. And then they monitored for anomalies, so a spike in number of mentions or a change in sentiment, and they've tracked this over time. Simultaneously, they were also following the OIE, which is the World Organization for Animal Health. And the OIE puts out outbreak reports in livestock. So these authors were following for anomaly detections as well as these outbreak reports to see if there was any sort of correlation. And it turns out that 75% of the anomaly spikes ultimately corresponded with an outbreak report. Now, of those 25% of spikes that had no corresponding report, those were in regions where the OIE had limited access, and so it's unclear if they actually did represent a true outbreak. But of those spikes that had a corresponding outbreak report, over half of them were present before the report was published. And in some cases, that anomaly spike occurred even weeks before the OIE report was published. And so this group posited that we could actually use Twitter to help us predict the next outbreak, not only in livestock, but potentially in humans. And they actually published their findings in December of 2019 as a new outbreak was emerging. But it was an enticing idea that we could use this wealth of information to help surveil the public and evaluate for further outbreaks. So these two groups looked at when. Another group looked at, can we use Twitter to figure out where? So what this group did is they looked at the geographic distribution of unique users discussing pneumonia and dry cough between December 15th, 2019 and January 21st, 2020. Now, just as a reminder, the World Health Organization picked up the report of a cluster of pneumonias in Wuhan on December 31st. So these folks looked at tweets, and after filtering out press releases and news accounts, they compared the signal to the same time frame the year prior. And they found that there was a dramatic increase in Twitter mentions of either pneumonia or dry cough in areas of Europe that would later become COVID hotspots, such as in Lombardy, northern Italy, in Madrid, as well as in the UK. And these spikes in Twitter mentions occurred weeks before the outbreaks were announced by the local government. Now, this is all with the caveat that these researchers were retrospectively looking for this signal. And so they acknowledge that the challenge moving forward would be to develop an adequate algorithm that could predict prospectively. But again, the idea that this could be utilized for epidemiologic surveillance is pretty enticing. So we've talked about when, we've talked about where. Let's also talk about the use of Twitter to figure out what. So in March of 2020, we just had 3 symptoms attributed to COVID-19. It was dry cough, fever, and shortness of breath. We now know that that list of symptoms has greatly expanded, But Guo et al. Wanted to see, could we use Twitter to actually identify additional symptoms attributable to this new outbreak? So what they did is they looked at thousands of tweets originating from the US alone, and they looked at it over a time period of March to May 2020, so just 3 months. And they looked for tweets containing dry cough or fever or shortness of breath and COVID-19. And they filtered out retweets and news accounts, and then they evaluated for any evidence of new symptoms. And they actually had bedside nurses to review this as well for a sense of control. And what they found was pretty interesting. They found mentions of loss of smell, loss of taste, GI symptoms, skin findings, including COVID toes, mention of blood clots, and as well as headaches. And so all of these symptoms, which have subsequently been added to possible symptoms related to COVID, were actually mentioned by users on Twitter prior to these being added to the list of the illness script of COVID. I think as an aside, it's pretty remarkable the amount of personal information people are willing to put online. But as a researcher, it's a pretty rich resource for us to use. So again, these folks looked at physical manifestations of COVID and how that was represented on Twitter. Other groups also looked at the mental impact of the pandemic. And there was a lot of concern about this pandemic of isolation. People were suddenly in lockdown, they were working from home, and there was a lot of concern about the mental health of the public. And so a couple groups actually looked, can we see this manifesting on social media? So Guntuku et al. Looked at tweets both from 2019 and 2020 and applied standardized loneliness scale. Now this is a validated scale that's been used in research previously. And what they saw was following the declaration of a national emergency in 2020, there was a dramatic increase in that standardized loneliness scale score, as you can see outlined in orange for 2020, when compared to the same time frame in 2019. They also applied a standardized stress scale, again with 2020 being in orange and 2019 in green. And as you can see, there was an increase in stress documented on Twitter as well. Now, another group looked specifically at depression, anxiety, stress, and suicidal ideation. And as you can see in the solid lines, which depicts 2020, the scores were much higher than compared to that same time frame in 2019. Now, both of these groups posited that maybe we could use monitoring Twitter as a way to monitor the mental health of the public and to focus our public health interventions, specifically with an eye towards mental health. Now, again, the limitation with this, as with many of the other studies I've talked about, was that this was retrospective. We knew what to look for. And so the challenge moving forward of using Twitter as a tool is figuring out how we can build those effective algorithms to utilize that information put out there by the public on Twitter as a way to augment our current surveillance tools that we have in place. And taking that a step further, could we actually use Twitter as a way to predict the next outbreak? Again, there are limitations, but the idea is somewhat enticing. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about how Twitter has impacted the field of medicine, both as a research tool as well as a source of information. But I think it's also important to talk about that human aspect and how social media plays a role in outreach and activism. Now, this is a massive topic and could be a talk on its own, both within the field of medicine and society as a whole. But I'm going to focus on just two movements that pertain to the pandemic. And that was the hashtag #GetMePPE, and this is our shot. And for those of you who don't use social media, the hashtag is a way that you can tag your messages. People can follow specific hashtags for topics. It's a way of broadening your reach of your tweets beyond your social network. So let's first talk about PPE. So in March of 2020, as we were grappling with this new pandemic, we were also very concerned about our PPE supply. And a group actually surveyed over 1,000 healthcare institutions in the US in early March about how they felt their supplies were for PPE. Did they have adequate PPE? And the long story short is many said no. 76% reported they had a shortage of eye protection, 82% reported a shortage of masks, and 37% reported a shortage of gloves, with 70% having not enough hand sanitizer. So this was a problem that was very widespread. And in that setting, the hashtag #GetMePPE emerged on Twitter. It was started by a few folks who wanted to stimulate stories about the shortages of PPE in hospitals, and also to raise awareness about the Defense Production Act, which was thought to be a mechanism that the government could use for mass production of PPE. So it goes live on Twitter on March 16th. The following day, on March 17, a group of frontline doctors joined together to create the #GetMePPE petition and an additional hashtag called #GetUsPPE. And within hours of this petition being published, there were thousands of signatures, with the idea that this petition would push the government into action. Well, by March 20th, there was no clear governmental action happening at that time. And there was still this dramatic need for PPE. And so Dr. Shuhan, he, along with a number of software engineers, graphic design artists, even students from the Harvard School of Business, all of whom connected via Twitter, ended up launching getusppe.org as a platform for action. The following day, dozens of grassroots organizations joined forces under the Get Us PPE coalition. And then by March 22nd, just a week after the hashtag was created, PPE donations, requests, and distribution starts. Now, this movement was shared broadly amongst healthcare workers, but it also actually was shared by other public figures. Like, for example, Chelsea Clinton even shared this movement. And requests came pouring in from all over the country. And ultimately, Get Us PPE actually partnered with Boston Scientific and Amazon, and they've received over 22,000 requests for PPE and have distributed over 10 million articles of PPE. And so this is a really amazing example of concrete results coming from a hashtag starting on Twitter. There's actually PPE being distributed across the country from an idea that was started on social media. I think an important thing to mention, though, is a little more nebulous, I should say. This hashtag also spurred people to share their stories. And this story was picked up by news outlets like the New York Times, but it also motivated other healthcare workers to share their experience and what they were seeing and experiencing caring for COVID-19 patients. And I think Dr. Craig Spencer summed it up well. He's an emergency medicine doctor in New York and shared a lot of his experience on Twitter caring for COVID-19 patients. He said, reflect on the fact that it's really hard to understand how bad this is and how bad it's going to be if all you see are empty streets. Hospitals are nearing capacity, we're running out of ventilators, ambulance sirens don't stop. And so in a time where healthcare workers were being inundated with infected patients and struggling to find appropriate PPE, the general public found themselves at home on quarantine, working from their couch. Hospitals were closing their doors to visitors, and there was a lot of misinformation given to the public about what was actually happening. And so this enabled people to share their narrative, to share their story, and to explain what they were experiencing, which I think has a lot of power and impact. And in another place where healthcare workers were sharing their experience was a movement a little later in the pandemic. And that was with the vaccination. Hashtag this is our shot. There was a number of hashtags that folks were sharing as they were getting their COVID-19 vaccination. My favorite was the Fauci ouchie. But folks were taking to Twitter to share their stories. And I remember amongst the residents, there was so much excitement for these vaccines. Their efficacy was amazing. They were developed so quickly. There was just a lot of enthusiasm in the medical community for these vaccinations. However, outside of that community, there was a lot of concern, particularly among populations that have historically been traumatized and marginalized by the healthcare system. There was worry about how rapidly the vaccine was developed. And so with that, a lot of healthcare workers actually took to social media to share their story, their selfies, of course, as they're getting vaccinated, but also their why for getting vaccinated. And this is a slide I borrowed from Dr. Jackie Parcham, who is an OB/GYN doc at UT Health. And she actually took stories of pregnant healthcare workers who posted their selfies on Twitter and took their stories with her to Capitol Hill to advocate for inclusion of pregnant and lactating people in further vaccine trials. And you may say, great, thanks, Dr. Parcham, for advocating for this, but why does it really matter that people are sharing their pictures? Who cares about these selfies of getting their vaccinations? Well, it turns out that it actually matters. Our narrative story has impact, and there's been studies looking at this. So Braddock and Dillard did a really great meta-analysis of studies that evaluated a narrative's persuasive influence when used in conjunction with healthcare interventions. And every single manuscript they looked at, they saw that a personal narrative had greater influence than data alone. And they saw influence on beliefs, attitudes, intentions, and maybe even most importantly, they saw impact on patient behaviors. And so I think that in and of itself is the biggest power of social media, is that it's a platform for us to share our narratives for better or for worse. And that platform has significant power and impact on the community around us. So this was a whirlwind tour of social media, and I could talk much longer, and there are many topics that I didn't get to, like medical education and the hierarchy in medicine. I will save that for another time. But I really hope that the big take-home points that you guys take away from this is that people see social media as a news source, and particularly during a time of crisis. It also leads to decreased time for information dissemination, but false information may actually spread faster and farther than true information. There's potential to use Twitter and social media as a surveillance or predictive tool for the next outbreak. And most importantly, it's a platform for outreach, activism, and engagement. And so I will pause there, but I have to say thank you before I open up for questions. particularly, I want to thank a few of my mentors, Dr. Rosemary Adamson and Dr. Brad Anawalt, who've been great coaches and mentors. And specifically, I want to shout out to my residency class, who have really helped me grow into the person and doctor I am today. So thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. What an incredible talk, covering such a broad scope, but also presenting some really intriguing evidence for all of the points that you made. We had a few questions that came in during the talk, but I want to encourage people to feel free to use the chat in the raise hand function. Unfortunately, we aren't able to unmute you and let you speak that way. So we'll be reading your questions in the chat. I think one of the things that came up as a theme, sort of as we're going through the last year, it's hard to tease apart the politics of the time of COVID from what was going on, and sort of as a backdrop for all of the data that you presented around that year. And so one of the questions that sort of came up when you were talking about the dissemination of false information, how wasn't politics overlaid over that, or how was it controlling for that aspect of it?
Yeah, so the studies that actually looked at the true and false information was in a time frame before the pandemic itself. And so they controlled for inflammatory language, as well as factors for politically tense topics. They had a bunch of modeling that they did that I didn't get into. They had controlled tweets for politically inflammatory ones, and were able to model how those moved compared to just true and false information, and were able to control for it that way. And so that figure that showed that exchange of speed was a process data that was all controlled for as best they could with modeling. But it's a great question. And that time frame that they were looking at was actually before Trump's time in office.
So an important distinction as far as controlling for potentially a very politically charged era. I think,
and I'll add, Johnny, that the authors did note that the patterns they found before controlling for inflammatory information was even more disparate. The inflammatory information caused even more rapid spread.
Makes total sense. I wanted to point out another question that's probably going to be harder for you to answer, but the question of why must come up a lot around this. Why is false information so much easier to spread on social media?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I wish I had the answer to. And part of that paper that I presented is their hope was that once controlling for the inflammatory nature of some false information, that we wouldn't see a difference. But in fact, we do. And so a lot of people attribute that spread of false information to the inflammatory nature of the topic. But it turns out that there's something else that causes false information to spread rapidly. So I don't have an answer. I wish I did. But I think it's important for us to know, particularly as more people are turning to social media for a source of information.
Well, thank you again, Illana. As has been noted in the chat, what a creative, innovative, and delightful presentation that's going to be certainly thought-provoking and discussion-provoking for those in the audience. We look forward to seeing all the incredible things you do in your career as you leave the University of Washington. Your email address portends that you are heading to University of California, San Francisco. So thanks, Illana. It's, as always, a privilege to learn from you. And I'm going to pause now, unless there's any other questions, and we can turn it over to Drs. Steinberg and Ppe to do the awards presentation part of this hour.
Thanks, Johnny. And hi, everyone. Illana, thank you so much for a really amazing presentation. Doug, I see you there as well. And Doug, Ppe, and I are going to present the 2021 Robert S. Evans Awards for the Department of Medicine. And Doug, I don't know if you want me to present the background or you would like to.
You can go ahead, Ken.
Okay, thank you, Doug. So Robert Evans, Dr. Evans, was a faculty member here at the University of Washington who served as the chief of medicine for many years at the Seattle VA. And he was known for really having special qualities of warmth and understanding, compassion, and concern for the needs of others, and was a really beloved member of the faculty. I never got a chance to meet him, but I've heard stories about him from Dr. Bremner and other senior members of our department. And unfortunately, Dr. Evans died, I believe, in a tragic automobile accident back in the 70s. And this award was created by the department to honor him. He's perhaps best known, Illana, next slide, please. Illana, are you there? Oh, thank you. This is a small slide, but he's perhaps best known for describing what is now known as Evans syndrome, primary thrombocytopenic purpura and acquired hemolytic anemia. So again, with that and given who he was and his humanistic qualities, this award was created in his honor. Next slide, please. Here you see a list of the award winners. The award goes every year to a graduating medical student and a second year medical resident. The award was originally designed to go to one person each year, but you can see from this list in some years, it's been hard to select a single person. And in some years, there are dual winners. But I think if you look at this list, you will just see some really amazing physicians on the list, from my co-presenter, Doug Ppe, to many other members of the Department of Medicine. And hopefully you'll recognize many of the people on this list, especially for newer members of the department, people on the right-hand side of the list. So with that, next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ppe to introduce the students who are this year's winners of the Evans Award. Doug?
Thank you, Ken. And yeah, this is a very special award as it really recognizes lots of qualities that I think are so key in being a great physician and really a citizen, you know, being able to work with other people and connect and really help with healing. And you know, Bud Evans really did, I've heard so many stories about him over the years and what a phenomenal person he was and how he just helped lift the spirits of everybody else and help support everybody else. And you know, I think in this era we're in right now, which is such a difficult time for everybody in the health profession, these qualities are just so crucial. And we just, you know, it was really a wonderful time this year on our committee. We saw so many of our residents and so many of our medical students exhibit just unbelievable Evans qualities and make it hard to find a recipient or one person. This year we have 2 recipients for the medical student awards, and I'm going to mention, you know, both of them here. The first one, Cass Sunga, who will be doing their residency at UW in medicine this coming year. And let me just read comment on Cass. I was most impressed with their communication skills with patients and family members. They often spend a substantial amount of time updating family members in the afternoon. One particular patient, I recall that Cass would sometimes sit in the room to keep him company as he did not have any close friends or family. Cass would use their love for music as a way to connect with patients. They had a great bedside manner. So congratulations to Cass, who I know will be an absolutely stellar physician. The other recipient this year is Noah Smith, and I want to read some comments about Noah that I think really embody a lot of the special Evans qualities that Noah has brought forth. Noah is a warm, kind, deeply thoughtful person who clearly loves working with patients. He is also capable and reliable, working independently throughout the day to move care forward on complex patients. His bedside manner was remarkable. He was genuinely compassionate and empathetic towards everyone. So congratulations to Cass and Noah.
Thanks, Doug. I'll now present the 2021 Evans Award to a member of our R2 class. And I want to say, just as Doug said, so many people in the class exhibited Evans qualities, and it's really a testament to the current R2 class that 49 out of 53 of the second year residents received at least one vote. That's remarkable. But this resident received more votes, including more votes from his peer residents than anyone else. And his evaluations from supervisors and students who he's worked with are full of comments about his humanism and his compassion. And just like Doug, to read a few quick comments, his bedside manner is something to behold. There are many times he has staffed with me that it is clear that he is taking opportunities to have the hard discussions about pain management, medical decision-making, mental health, or other topics that others might otherwise be quick to move past. The work he puts into those conversations surely is tiring, but are so important to excellent doctoring. He is able to balance deep empathy with healthy boundaries. And the last quote that showed up in one of his evaluations, that it is obvious, next slide, please. It is obvious that Dr. Gehring loves his fellow human beings. He lives up to the words of Hippocrates, quote, "Wherever the art of medicine is loved, there is also a love of humanity." Congratulations, Cody. This is a very well-deserved award. With that, that concludes the awards. Johnny, back to you for any final comments.
I think that you said it all. What a well-deserving group to be awarded, and accolades, including Illana. Congratulations to her for completing this chief resident year, and everyone else. Thank you for being here with us. This concludes this week's Department of Medicine Grand Rounds, and we'll see you next week for the final presentation of the academic year and a few more awards and one more presentation. Thanks, everyone.